My name is Darcy Ingram. I'm 32 years old. And 3 days before my wedding, my father called to tell me he wouldn't walk me down the aisle. Not because he was sick. Not because of an emergency. Because my sister said it would upset her. 6 words. That's all it took to rearrange 32 years of understanding. I'm not walking you down the aisle. Tuesday evening. Cold October rain tapping against the workshop windows. I was trimming roses for the centerpieces when the phone rang. My hands smelled like lavender and wet soil. Playlist low in the background. String lights glowing above the workbench. Caller ID. Dad. I answered with my elbow because my fingers were muddy. At first, I thought someone had died. Because people don't use that voice unless something terrible already happened. Darcy, he said quietly. I need to tell you something. Then the sentence. Calm. Flat. Cowardly in the way only rehearsed sentences can be. I'm not walking you down the aisle. I set the pruning shears down carefully. Very carefully. Because suddenly, everything sharp felt dangerous. 5 seconds passed. Maybe 6. Long enough to hear the refrigerator humming in the next room. Long enough to realize this wasn't a joke. Then finally. Why? Small word. Heavy enough. Vanessa says it would upset her. Of course. Vanessa. My older sister. 35. 2 children. Cracking marriage hidden beneath expensive countertops and curated Instagram photos. And somehow, still the gravitational center of my parents' universe. Your sister is going through a difficult time, Dad continued carefully. Her marriage, you know. I did know. Everyone knew. Preston slept in the office now. Vanessa drank wine at noon. And Thanksgiving dinner had started sounding like people trying not to scream underwater. But this was my wedding. Not her divorce rehearsal. So my wedding day is about Vanessa's feelings? Silence. I could hear a television somewhere behind him. A game show audience clapping. Artificial happiness echoing through the phone. Then finally, she said, if I walk you down the aisle. Pause. She won't bring the kids to Christmas. There it was. The leverage. Same as always. Lily and Owen. My father's grandchildren. Vanessa weaponized them constantly. And my father folded every single time. Because weakness disguised itself as peacekeeping in our family. Okay, Dad. Darcy, please understand. I understand perfectly. Then I hung up. No yelling. No crying. No dramatic speech. Just silence. Because honestly, I wasn't shocked anymore. Only tired. 10 minutes later, my mother called. Of course she did. Donna Ingram never leaves emotional messes unfinished. She organizes them. Your father told you? Yes. Darcy, don't turn this into drama. Interesting sentence. People who create pain always call the reaction drama. Lots of modern brides walk alone, she continued. It's actually empowering if you think about it. She said empowering the same way people say organic when they've never bought organic once in their lives. Mom, I said slowly. I asked Dad a year ago. And he said yes. Things change. There it was. The philosophy of my entire childhood. Things change. When Vanessa wants them to. My mother inhaled carefully. Measured breath. Controlled voice. The tone she used whenever she'd already decided her own logic mattered more than anyone else's feelings. You have Marcus, she said. Vanessa has no one right now. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was so perfectly Donna. My happiness always counted less. Because I survived it better. That was the hierarchy in our family. Vanessa's emotions. Then the grandchildren. Then my parents' comfort. Then somewhere far below seasonal allergies and property taxes. Me. I hung up. Walked outside. Sat on the porch steps. The garden stretched in front of me quietly. Hydrangeas fading for winter. Lavender still holding on stubbornly. Dogwood tree taller than the roofline now. I planted every inch of it myself after buying this house 4 years earlier. Built something living from empty ground. Funny. That seemed to be the story of my entire life. Marcus found me 20 minutes later. Didn't ask questions immediately. Didn't force conversation. Just sat beside me. Warm shoulder against mine. Steady. After a while. What happened? My dad backed out. Marcus nodded once. No surprise. Because Marcus understood my family almost immediately after meeting them. You don't want to walk alone, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. No. Silence again. Then softly. Dad's been practicing tie knots for 3 weeks. I looked at him. What? Marcus smiled slightly. I caught him watching YouTube tutorials Sunday morning. And suddenly, something inside me cracked open. Not pain. Something warmer. Because the man who wasn't biologically related to me had apparently been preparing to show up long before I asked. Frank Delaney. Marcus's father. Retired carpenter. Hands rough as cedar bark. Voice like gravel and patience. The kind of man who fixes broken hinges without announcing it. Who notices when your porch railing feels loose. Who builds bookshelves with hidden initials carved into the wood. He'd been part of my life for 3 years. 3 years of Sunday dinners. Workshop visits. Coffee in thermoses. Quiet consistency. And somehow, without realizing it, I had started measuring fatherhood against him. That realization hurt more than my dad's phone call. Because once someone treats you correctly, you notice every place you were tolerated instead of loved. I drove to Frank's workshop the next morning. Small brown house outside Chester. Garage smelled like sawdust and linseed oil. Classic rock playing softly somewhere in the background. Frank was sanding a rocking chair when I walked in. He looked up immediately. Kid. Then stopped. Because good people notice pain quickly. My dad isn't walking me anymore. Frank set the sandpaper down slowly. Didn't ask why. Didn't make me explain. Just wiped his hands on his apron and said, "When do you need me?" That was it. No hesitation. No speech. No emotional performance. One sentence. Immediate. Steady. Reliable. And standing there in a workshop smelling like cedar dust, I realized something devastating. The easiest people to ask for love are usually the ones who were never obligated to give it. I cried in the car afterward. First time all week. Not because my father abandoned the aisle. Because another man stepped into it without pause. That difference mattered more. Way more. Wednesday disappeared in logistics. Flowers. Seating charts. Last-minute cancellations. Tiny disasters pretending to be emergencies. Normally, wedding chaos feels exciting. But after my father's call, everything felt strangely quiet. Like my emotions had stepped outside the room temporarily. Jeanette took over most of the damage control. Best friend since sophomore year. Blunt enough to insult your haircut while fixing it. The kind of woman who weaponizes competence when people she loves are hurting. She updated the seating chart without asking questions. The seat labeled Father of the Bride became Frank Delaney. Simple change. Massive meaning. I stared at the revised chart for a long time. Because suddenly, something about the wedding felt more honest than before. Not easier. Honest. Thursday morning. My phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa. I heard you're not walking alone. Pause. Who is it? I didn't answer. 10 minutes later, she texted Jeanette instead. Jeanette forwarded me the screenshot immediately. Do you know who's walking Darcy? Jeanette's response. A single period. Nothing else. I laughed for the first time in 2 days. Because sometimes silence says exactly enough. That afternoon, Ruth Kellerman arrived unexpectedly. 70 years old. Silver hair always pinned perfectly. Former elementary school teacher. My grandmother Eleanor's closest friend for 4 decades. Ruth carried a yellowed envelope in both hands carefully. Like something fragile enough to change shape if held wrong. She wanted you to have this when you got married, Ruth said softly. 11 years ago. My stomach tightened immediately. Because Eleanor, my grandmother, had been the only person in my childhood who ever looked at me like I mattered without conditions attached. She died when I was 21. Pancreatic cancer. Fast. Cruel. I still remembered her hands. Always warm. Always smelling faintly like rosemary. I opened the envelope slowly at the kitchen table. Ruth sat across from me silently, giving grief room instead of interrupting it. The letter inside was short. My grandmother never wasted words. Darcy, it began. When you read this, you are about to walk into the most important room of your life. I already felt tears building. Then came the line that destroyed me completely. I wish I could tell your mother to sit down and let you shine. I stopped breathing for a second. Because Eleanor saw everything. Even when nobody else admitted it aloud. I kept reading. You have always been the one who builds. From that little greenhouse to whatever life you create later. You make things grow where nothing should. Then the final sentence. The people who show up are your real family. I read the letter 3 times. Folded it carefully. Placed it inside my clutch bag for the wedding. Because suddenly, it felt less like advice. More like permission. That night, Marcus stayed with Frank. Tradition technically. But honestly, I think neither of them wanted Frank pacing his kitchen alone before the wedding. Jeanette slept over instead. She found me reorganizing centerpieces in the workshop at 11:30. Darcy. What? You've moved those roses 4 times. I looked down. She was right. I sighed. What if everyone notices? Notices what? That my father didn't choose me. Jeanette stared at me for exactly 2 seconds before answering. They'll notice. Honest. Always honest. Then she stepped closer. But they'll also notice who did. That sentence settled somewhere deep inside me. Because people remember absence loudly. Until presence gives them something better to look at. Friday evening was the rehearsal dinner. Converted barn glowing under string lights. Copper vases. Wildflowers. Lavender tied with twine. Everything smelled like cedar and October air. Most of the guests came from Marcus's side. Big family. Warm family. The kind that speaks over each other constantly because nobody's afraid of being unheard. My side was smaller. Jeanette. Ruth. A few college friends. Women from the Saturday greenhouse workshops I teach. Clients who slowly became chosen family over the years. No parents. No Vanessa. No sign they planned to attend at all. Honestly, part of me preferred it that way. Then Frank stood for the toast. Navy tie slightly crooked despite multiple practice attempts. Hands rough against the champagne glass. Room quiet immediately. Because authenticity has gravity. It changes air pressure. I'm not much for speeches, Frank began. Marcus says if I talk too long he'll play me off with a trombone. Laughter broke softly around the room. Then Frank looked at me. Really looked. The first time Darcy came to my house. She repotted a dying fern without being asked. People smiled. Frank continued quietly. I knew right then. Any woman who saves a dying plant automatically belongs in this family. The room went still. Not silent. Full. Heavy in the best possible way. Then came the sentence I would carry forever. I never had a daughter. Pause. Guess life just made me wait longer than expected. Jeanette cried immediately. Ruth pressed a napkin against her eyes. Marcus squeezed my hand beneath the table so tightly I could feel his pulse. And for the first time in my entire life, I experienced what it felt like to be claimed publicly. Not tolerated. Not included conditionally. Chosen. That was the difference. Later that night, after everyone left, I stayed behind fixing one of the centerpieces near the barn entrance. The venue empty now. Only string lights glowing softly overhead. Marcus appeared beside me quietly. You okay? I nodded. Then shook my head. Both? Both. He smiled slightly. Then my phone buzzed. Dad. One text. Your mother thinks we should still come tomorrow. I stared at the screen. No apology. No explanation. Not even. I changed my mind. Just logistics. Attendance framed like obligation. Marcus read my expression immediately. What? They're coming. Do you want them there? That question hit harder than expected. Because nobody in my family ever asked what I wanted. Not really. I looked around the empty barn. At the flowers I grew myself. The tables arranged by people who actually showed up. Frank's crooked tie still hanging over a chair nearby. And suddenly, I realized something strange. My parents attending no longer felt necessary. Only symbolic. Like actors arriving late to a play already happening without them. They can come, I said finally. But they don't get to ruin this. Marcus nodded once. Good. Then softer. They already lost more than they realize. That night, I slept surprisingly well. Maybe because for the first time in my life, I stopped waiting for my parents to become different people. And acceptance? Real acceptance? Is strangely peaceful. Even when it hurts. Saturday morning arrived cold and bright. Sharp blue sky. Thin October sunlight spilling across the garden outside the bridal suite. Everything smelled like eucalyptus, coffee, and fresh hairspray. Women moved around me in soft chaos. Makeup brushes. Zippers. Bobby pins clutched between teeth. Someone steaming dresses in the corner. Someone else crying over forgotten earrings. Typical wedding morning. Except underneath all of it, there was tension. Not loud tension. Quiet tension. The kind people pretend not to notice because everyone's trying to protect the bride. Jeanette checked her phone every 12 minutes. Marcus's cousin kept asking whether extra chairs should be added near the back row. And I knew exactly why. My parents. Nobody knew if they were actually coming. Not even me. At 11:15. While the makeup artist curled the final section of my hair, Ruth appeared in the doorway holding a small velvet box. Your grandmother wanted you to have these too. Inside. Pearl earrings. Tiny. Simple. Elegant in the way Eleanor always was. I touched them carefully. Then noticed something folded beneath the velvet lining. A tiny note in my grandmother's handwriting. Wear these when someone finally sees your worth clearly. That did it. I cried immediately. Not graceful tears either. Real ones. The ugly kind that ruin mascara. Jeanette shoved tissues into my hands while muttering. Your grandmother had unbelievable timing from beyond the grave. By 1 o'clock. Guests started arriving at the vineyard. Rows of white chairs lined the hill overlooking gold autumn trees. String quartet warming up softly. Candles protected inside glass lanterns against the wind. Everything looked exactly how I imagined it for months. Only now. It somehow felt calmer. More solid. Because the fear underneath it was finally gone. I wasn't waiting for rescue anymore. At 1:23. Jeanette slipped into the bridal suite quietly. They're here. No explanation needed. I looked up from the mirror slowly. How bad? She hesitated. Which answered enough already. Your mom's crying. Vanessa? Acting like she's attending a hostage negotiation. Honestly. That tracked perfectly. And Dad? Jeanette softened slightly. He looks miserable. Something inside me twisted painfully at that. Because despite everything, I still loved my father. That's the complicated thing people rarely talk about. Love doesn't disappear just because disappointment becomes permanent. At 1:38. The wedding coordinator knocked gently. 5 minutes. Everyone cleared out slowly after that. Giving me space. Jeanette lingered near the doorway. You ready? I looked at myself in the mirror. Ivory dress. Pearl earrings. Grandmother's note tucked safely inside my bouquet ribbon. And for the first time all week. I actually was. I think so. Then the door opened again. Frank stepped inside awkwardly. Immediately uncomfortable in formal clothes. Navy suit slightly too stiff. Tie still imperfect. Hands visibly nervous. And suddenly, everything became real. He looked at me once. Then immediately looked away. Like the sight hit him emotionally harder than expected. Well, he muttered quietly. You clean up pretty good, kid. I laughed through tears. Frank rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Then reached into his jacket pocket. Pulled out a folded index card. What's that? I asked. I wrote instructions. For myself. I blinked. Instructions? He nodded seriously. Things not to do. He handed me the card. Don't cry first. Walk slow. Don't forget rings. Let Darcy have moment. I laughed so hard mascara threatened its life again. Frank smiled slightly. Then softly. Your dad's an idiot. Not cruelly. Just honestly. And somehow. That honesty felt kinder than every excuse my parents gave combined. The ceremony music began outside. Low cello notes drifting through the walls. Guests standing. Wind moving softly through vineyard leaves. My heartbeat suddenly loud enough to feel physical. Frank offered his arm carefully. Like this was something sacred. And maybe it was. You ready, kid? I looked at him. Really looked. At the man who practiced tie knots for weeks. Who stepped forward without hesitation. Who chose me instantly when my own father stepped back. Then I nodded. Yeah. We stepped outside together. The aisle stretched ahead between rows of white chairs and golden trees. People turning slowly to watch. Music swelling gently. And there, third row left side, sat my parents. My mother already crying. My father staring directly at me. Not at the flowers. Not at the guests. Me. And suddenly, I saw it clearly on his face. Regret. Raw. Immediate. The kind that arrives too late to stop damage, but early enough to fully feel it. Vanessa sat beside them rigidly. Arms crossed tightly. Expression hard as glass. But for once, she wasn't the center. Nobody cared whether Vanessa felt comfortable. The ceremony had moved beyond her gravity completely. Frank squeezed my hand once before we started walking. Small gesture. Steadying. Then softly. Head up. So I lifted my chin. And we walked. Slowly. Deliberately. Not replacing my father. Not pretending nothing happened. Something more honest than that. A man choosing to show up. That was the difference. Halfway down the aisle, I glanced toward my father again. Huge mistake. Because his eyes were already wet. And suddenly, I remembered every tiny moment he almost defended me but didn't. Every silence. Every compromise. Every time peace mattered more than courage. And for the first time in my life, I realized weakness can wound people just as deeply as cruelty. Frank brought me to the altar. Marcus looked devastatingly handsome and 1 second away from crying himself. Frank kissed my forehead lightly. Then whispered something only I could hear. The people who stay matter more than the people who leave. And then, he placed my hand into Marcus's. Not giving me away. Trusting someone else to keep choosing me too. That distinction mattered. The ceremony blurred beautifully after that. Vows. Laughter. Wind lifting the veil slightly. Marcus crying openly during his promises despite insisting all week he wouldn't. At one point, I looked toward the crowd again. Dad was crying silently now. No hiding it anymore. My mother held his hand tightly. And suddenly, they looked older than I remembered. Not physically. Emotionally. Like they were finally understanding the cost of every compromise they made for Vanessa's comfort. Because sitting in that third row, watching another man walk their daughter toward happiness, they could finally see what absence creates. Not drama. Distance. Permanent distance. And some distances never fully close again. When the officiant pronounced us married, the entire vineyard erupted. Cheers. Applause. Jeanette sobbing without shame. Frank pretending he had something in his eye. Marcus kissing me like he'd waited his whole life for permission. And standing there beneath October sunlight, I realized something unexpected. My father not walking me down the aisle didn't ruin the wedding. It revealed it. Revealed who actually carried me toward love. And honestly, that truth was worth seeing. Even painfully, the reception started at sunset. Golden light pouring through the barn windows. Candles flickering against old wood beams. Soft jazz floating beneath conversations and clinking glasses. For the first hour, everything felt almost normal. Not perfect. Just peaceful. Marcus danced with his mother. Jeanette bullied people into taking group photos. Frank quietly repaired a loose centerpiece stand without telling anyone. And me? I kept waiting for disaster. Because children raised inside emotional instability develop strange reflexes. You learn happiness rarely arrives alone. Usually, it brings consequences with it. At 7:15, The speeches began. Best man first. Then Marcus's cousin Elena. Funny stories. Childhood embarrassments. Everybody laughing warmly. Then the DJ announced. Father of the bride. The room shifted immediately. Because technically, nobody expected a speech. Not after the aisle. Not after the silence. I looked toward my father automatically. He stayed seated for 3 full seconds. Like his body hadn't agreed with his decision yet. Then slowly, he stood. The room quieted almost instantly. Dad walked toward the microphone stiffly. Hands trembling slightly. Not dramatic trembling. Nervous trembling. Human trembling. Vanessa looked horrified immediately. Because people like Vanessa survive by controlling narratives. And suddenly, control was slipping publicly. Dad reached the microphone. Cleared his throat once. Then twice. Classic nervous habit. He looked at me. Not the guests. Not the floor. Me. And for a second, he seemed unable to speak at all. Finally, when Darcy was 8, his voice cracked immediately. He stopped. Tried again. When Darcy was 8, she built a greenhouse behind our garage from scrap wood and old storm windows. A few people smiled softly. Dad swallowed hard. It leaked every time it rained. Door barely closed. But she spent 6 months fixing it anyway. I remembered that greenhouse instantly. Tiny structure. Crooked shelves. Tomato plants everywhere. Dad continued quietly. One night I asked her why she kept working on something falling apart. Long pause. Then he looked directly at me. And she said, because if nobody keeps trying, everything dies. The barn went completely still. Because suddenly, this wasn't a wedding speech anymore. It was confession. Dad gripped the microphone tighter. I think. Pause. I think my daughter spent most of her life trying to keep relationships alive, while the rest of us kept letting her do all the work. My chest tightened painfully. Across the room, my mother lowered her eyes immediately. Vanessa crossed her arms harder. Defensive posture. Predictable. Dad inhaled shakily. Then finally, I failed her today. No excuses. No mention of Vanessa's feelings. No complicated explanation. Just truth. Simple. Public. I let fear make decisions for me. And I hurt my daughter because hurting her was easier than disappointing someone else. A few guests looked toward Vanessa instinctively. She noticed. Her face hardened immediately. But Dad kept going. I told myself I was keeping peace. But peace that requires sacrificing one child for another isn't peace. Nobody moved. Nobody even touched their drinks. Because honesty changes rooms. It rearranges oxygen. Dad looked toward Frank then. Standing quietly near the dance floor. Still holding a wrench from fixing decorations earlier. And my father said something I never expected to hear in my lifetime. Frank. Thank you for doing what I should have done. Frank looked genuinely uncomfortable being publicly acknowledged. Which somehow made the moment even more sincere. Dad's eyes returned to me. Wet now. Unhidden. I spent years believing showing up quietly was enough. It wasn't. Then softer. So if you remember anything about me after tonight, I hope eventually it's that I finally showed up before it was too late. That sentence broke something open inside me. Because my father had never spoken emotionally in public. Not once. Not at graduations. Not funerals. Not birthdays. But now. Standing in front of everyone. He was finally telling the truth without hiding behind practicality. And truth. Real truth. Costs people like him everything. Silence held the room for another few seconds. Then someone started clapping softly. Ruth. Of course. Then Jeanette. Then Marcus's mother. And suddenly, the entire barn filled with applause. Not loud. Not celebratory. Something gentler. Recognition. My father stepped away from the microphone slowly. Like he wasn't entirely sure his legs still worked. When he reached the table, my mother grabbed his hand immediately. Crying openly now. Not polished tears. Real ones. Vanessa looked furious. Humiliated. Cornered by a truth she couldn't redirect. 10 minutes later, she cornered me near the dessert table. Naturally. Are you happy now? She hissed quietly. Interesting question. Because people who manipulate families always assume honesty is revenge. I looked at her calmly. No. That answer surprised her. Because it was true. I wasn't happy my father broke publicly. I wasn't happy my family fractured. I was sad it took this long. Vanessa scoffed. You always needed attention eventually. And there it was. The story she told herself. That visibility equals selfishness. Because if I deserved equal love, then her special treatment stopped looking earned. It was never about attention, I said quietly. It was about being treated like I mattered too. Vanessa opened her mouth. Then stopped. Because deep down, even she knew. She always knew. That's the thing about favoritism. The favored child usually recognizes it long before anyone says it aloud. They just benefit too much to challenge it. Later that night. After the dancing. After the cake. After most guests drifted toward parking lots and hotels. I stepped outside alone. Cold air. Crickets. October leaves scraping softly across gravel. The vineyard lights glowed behind me warmly. Dad found me near the fence line 10 minutes later. Hands shoved awkwardly into suit pockets. We stood side by side quietly for a while. Then finally, I'm sorry. No explanations this time. No conditions. Just apology. Simple. Human. I looked out across the dark vineyard rows. You really would have let her decide my wedding day. Dad closed his eyes briefly. Yes. Honest again. Painfully honest. I kept thinking if I handled Vanessa carefully enough, everything would stay together. I nodded slowly. Because I finally understood something about my father. He wasn't cruel. He was afraid. Afraid of conflict. Afraid of losing access to his grandchildren. Afraid of anyone being angry with him. And fear, left unchecked, becomes its own form of betrayal. Dad swallowed hard. When Frank took your arm today. Pause. I realized somebody else learned how to love my daughter better than I did. That sentence nearly destroyed me. Because it carried grief. Real grief. Not for the wedding moment itself. For all the years before it. I looked at him carefully. Then said the truest thing I knew. You still have time. Dad's eyes filled again immediately. Not because forgiveness fixes everything. It doesn't. Some moments stay broken forever. But broken things can still become honest. And honestly, that's sometimes the closest families ever get to healing. Marcus appeared in the doorway behind us then. Tie loosened. Smile soft. My wife disappeared, he said. Thought I should probably find her. My wife. The words settled warmly inside me. Dad looked between us quietly. Then nodded once. Like he finally understood what love looks like when nobody's competing for it. Marcus wrapped his arm around my waist gently. And together, we walked back toward the lights. Not because everything was fixed. Because life keeps moving even when people finally tell the truth. And sometimes, the family who fails you first teaches you exactly how to recognize the people who never will.